the entire media very upset that Florida has decided you're not allowed to indoctrinate kids in the bullcrap known as gender theory. You're not allowed to do this from K to 3. And the entire left says, how dare you do this? It's just terrible. It's just terrible. How could you do this? How could Florida do this? They're saying, don't say gay. How dare they do all of this? And it's not even relevant, say the left. And I mean, why would you even do this? We're not doing this at school. No, you are doing this at school. You are clearly doing this at school.
So Disney being a so-called woke corporation is something that I have discussed on this channel for a long, long time because I've been covering anti-SJW nerd channels who have often seemed convinced that their favourite film franchises are being ruined because people at the top of these corporations don't actually care about money anymore. They actually just care about pushing social justice and, I guess, feminism and talking about LGBT rights and stuff. They no longer care about the fans because, as we all know, corporations are woke. Corporations don't exist to make money. Corporation shareholders, they don't really care about money. They only care about projecting their liberal beliefs. And it makes me laugh. A company that is absolutely dominant like Disney, these guys think it's woke. Not only does it own basically every major blockbuster that comes out every single year, or at least in the top 10, it also has, you know, ESPN, ABC, it has its theme parks, it has its like the traditional Disney stuff, and now it has, of course, in the last decade, Star Wars, and it has Marvel. So the belief that this company does not care about profit, its business actions speak to the contrary of that because it's one of the biggest corporations in the world. Now these guys get confused, and if they see like liberal messaging in some films, really minor stuff, they think it's the corporation just wanting to do that. Again, not that it's maybe pandering to a new woke liberal audience, which it often is. They're just doing it at a loss, I guess, to try and brainwash Americans and Westerners. Totally ridiculous, but that is like the foundation for what is happening at the moment because Disney is being accused of promoting grooming by backing down on its stance on the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida after massive protests by Disney employees against them. Disney as this corporation is just pandering and trying to save face with its public image. It doesn't actually care about this stuff. It only cares about it as much as it can make money from it. Walt Disney was an anti-communist union buster who worked with the government, and he conformed to this Red Scare tactics in the 1940s. Disney has a history of this stuff. You have like Disney shows, like was it Girl Meets World? I made a whole video about this, which just like pushes anti-communism and stuff like that.
Communism. This is why it fell. People didn't want to all be the same.
Without incentive, there's no motivation. Without motivation, there's no advancement. In a truly free society, we share the best parts of ourselves without cheating. Because we get to learn who we are individually.
The belief that Disney is woke is so ridiculous. But the sinister part of this is that these anti-SJW nerd channels who would say that like, it's Disney's fault that Star Wars sucks now because Star Wars has gone woke, they've taken this to a way more sinister extreme now. They're accusing Disney of brainwashing young children into LGBT ideology and in essence, I guess, preying on them and sexualizing them, with the undertone being that people in the LGBT community are actually just sexual degenerates and perverts. That is some serious old transphobia and homophobia that really reminds me of the stuff I've read about the 1980s crusade against gay rights. So in this video today, we're going to look at anti-SJW nerd channels talking about this stuff, look at Ben Shapiro, then I want to go into how this groomer term has been normalized by conservative media before talking about how this is just another culture war repackaged from the 1980s and brought into the 2020s, primarily driven by this new massive crusade against transgender rights. So all of that coming up today. If you want to support my work, please check out my Patreon. I'm trying to get as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible, and at the moment the benefits of which I get my Nintendo Switch friend code and the private patrons Discord server. Also follow me on social media at the Kavernacle, on Twitter, on Instagram. I'm live streaming again 2 times a week, Tuesday and Thursday, and I'm archiving them on my second channel, the Kavernacle Extra. If you missed them, go check that out. Also join our communities on my subreddit. So like I said, I've been covering anti-SJW nerd channels for a long time, including like the Quartering and Geeks and Gamers. But over the last couple months, these channels have literally just like given up the pretense that they're not about politics anymore. Geeks and Gamers and more the Quartering literally are just political channels now. They will cover all these political topics, and the Quartering still does his usual stuff of literally just reading an article and not really giving much of his opinion, but throwing like a tiny bit of his opinion in there. So I'm going to respond to these videos in a sec, but I thought I should just maybe convey what is going on for some of you, because you might be unaware of this, especially if you're not from America. So Tess Owens at Vice reporting last week, anti-grooming rally at Disney is latest stop for culture war traveling circus. A cabal of culture warriors from the LA area have spent the past few years organizing pro-Trump rallies, storming businesses over mask requirements and terrorizing schools. This week they were joined by a ragtag group of far-right extremists and conspiracy theorists to protest outside Disney's headquarters in Burbank to air their latest grievances, grooming children. The Disney Corporation has been accused of supporting grooming children ever since it withdrew its support for Florida's Don't Say Gay law. The law, which has inspired similar legislation elsewhere, bans teachers from teaching kids up to age 12 anything about sexual orientation or gender identity. In just the past week, the Disney grooming conspiracy has rapidly morphed into wild claims that the corporation is on a covert mission to indoctrinate children with a satanic agenda. Obviously, where have you heard that before? The vast array of conspiracies against Disney has recently shown up everywhere, from social media feeds of Donald Trump Jr. and Marjorie Taylor Greene to anonymous forums and far-right Telegram channels. This far-right has latched on to the debacle, as well as a recent slew of state bills and laws targeting the LGBTQ community as an excuse to traffic entire transphobic and homophobic slurs, bashing gay and trans people as predators or pedophiles. On one pro-Trump forum, users have made threats against teachers, especially LGBTQ teachers. So the problem with this, it is not just fringe people believing in these types of conspiracy theories anymore. It's mainstream conservatism, and it's also being propped up and spread by anti-SJW nerd channels who are buying into this framing that Ron DeSantis, the fascist governor of Florida, and his Don't Say Gay bill is trying to stop the either sexualizing of children or indoctrinating them into gender identity ideology. Now, it's obviously such insane framing. If you even believe this framing, it shows your inherent bigotry, because being gay, being transgender, it's not about having literal sex. In my opinion, children do need to learn about this stuff, because what happens is that you never learn about it, and then there's so much transphobia and homophobia in your schools. Like, I went to school in the 2000s and 2010s. There was literally barely any representation in the media or politics of gay people and trans people. There was so much casual homophobia in high school. There were plenty of closeted gay people in our school who couldn't come out because the homophobia was so normalized. If we had all learned as children and actually been taught about this properly, I bet we would have fostered a more inclusive environment instead of this very, very hostile environment, probably not made any better by the fact that I went to Catholic school, although it was a fairly progressive Catholic school. But again, to frame this as like indoctrinating children and sexualizing them is just absolutely insane and obviously insanely bigoted. But now let's get into anti-SJW nerd channels. Now, Geeks and Gamers, the main channel, has posted panels they have done where they all discuss this stuff. So I want to get into the first video quick.
Funny to see how quickly all of this is turned around. It was, I believe, still less than a month ago on like March 7th or 8th when Bob Chapek came out and made that statement. We care about diversity representation, but we don't want to be a political football. We don't want to get involved.
Laughable.
This is after all the stuff that they've been doing. And their audience that they've been asking for, the audience that they've actively been pursuing while telling the old audience to get the fuck out, they held their feet to the fire. They said, no, you've said all these things. You better stand up for this. You better talk about this. And now we're in a position where Disney is issuing press releases about bills that become laws in certain states and say, we're going to do everything in our power to repeal this law, either by the legislation or by the courts. Disney, how are you? You're telling me you're going to do everything in your power to have the courts overturn this? How exactly does that work? So now you have this mega corporation literally threatening to interfere with a state doing government shit. It's out in the open now, but that's what happens, Bob Chapek. You get the audience you deserve.
Absolutely. And I do want to play this clip. It deserves to be looked at again. This is a clip from DeSantis and him calling Disney out.
For Disney to come out and put a statement and say that the bill should have never passed and that they are going to actively work to repeal it, I think one was fundamentally dishonest, but two, I think that crossed the line. This state is governed by the interests of the people of the state of Florida. It is not based on the demands of California corporate executives. They do not run this state. They do not control this state.
They literally responded to a Twitter mob. I feel like so many people feel like Twitter has a lot of power. That's what Disney believes. That's a Disney mindset. Like when they hear people screeching on Twitter, they think that that matters. Like it doesn't matter.
So it's like these guys were born yesterday and think that suddenly this is the first time in US politics that corporations have tried to interfere in politics. Corporations have been doing this in America for ages. Most corporations are capitalist institutions, so although they back both parties, they do back Republicans more to pass laws that benefit them, including massive deregulation. Why do you think these people like Trump so much? But these guys are all Trump supporters and they're whining about corporations influencing politics. There's a lot of irony there, but it's just pretty disturbing that they're all simping for DeSantis. Like this fascist guy cracked down on protests, cracked down on trans rights, gay rights, all these things. It's disturbing now they're not even pretending. They're not even just people who love nerd stuff and don't want like politics in them or something like that. It's like, nah, we all simp for this far right guy who might be president in the next couple years, and we want you all to know that. I want to play you one more video by them, the truth about Disney's power.
I think that puts like so much onus on the government being the ones that are engineering this versus there's just a lot of fucking woke activists in these fucking places. There just is. You can go and you can look at all these executives. None of those guys, none of those guys that we saw in Reimagine Tomorrow, none of those people are being incentivized to do that because of the government. That's just what they think needs to happen. So I think we're putting a lot of stuff on this whole ESG thing as opposed to just coming to terms with the fact that leftists have taken control of these companies.
Are these guys ever going to realize that CEOs of massive companies are not leftists? I know a lot of right-wing Americans don't really understand politics that well, in the sense that like capitalist liberals who aren't complete hateful zealots are still capitalists, right? And leftists do not like them. And like most capitalists, even if they have their own personal beliefs, then maybe they don't hate all gay people like a lot of conservatives, that they will still do what's best for their business. That's what Disney is doing. Yes, maybe a lot of them personally do believe woke things. They're also capitalists. How woke can they be? How left-wing can they be? The answer for you guys is not that many. And as someone who is a left-wing person, I absolutely hate liberal ideology. Liberals to me are just so inconsistent, and often their racism shows through. Like, for example, you know, the Ukraine stuff is really bad. We're all talking about it. Most of us are against Russia and stuff. But at the same time, those liberals who will make their whole identity like a Ukrainian flag will never say a word about what Israel does to Palestinians. Even recently, complete silence. And that's why we hate liberals, because they're very, very selective. But these guys don't understand that people like Bob Chapek and the board of Disney, even if they're liberals, they aren't woke, they aren't left-wing, they aren't pushing these messages because they want to indoctrinate children. They're doing it because they think there's a market for it and they want to appeal to that new woke market. So the Quartering now is obviously just like a far-right conservative news channel. And then I'm just going to play you a little clip of what he thinks about left-wing people owning everything.
The right is finally fighting back. You're going after the kids. They're trying to do just terrible things to them, and we're going to put a stop to it. Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's important that you fight back, but also like you have to be effective in it. And right now, you know, the left has the entirety of corporate media. They have, you know, late night talk show hosts. They have all this stuff on their side, and the right has to get better because they lost the branding about the whole, you know, how they said of don't say gay. That's the presumable narrative. Very few people knew what it was actually called. They have to learn how to call it the anti-grooming bill first, and then beat them at their own game.
The Quartering calling it the anti-grooming bill, but I do laugh at like, the left has everything. We have late night TV. We have every news outlet. We have all the journalists on our sides. These guys obviously live in an American bubble where there are like some more visible liberal people, I guess like Jimmy Kimmel or I don't know, Jimmy Fallon. It's just a laughable thing that so many millionaire capitalists are perceived as leftists. Not to mention, just like in the UK, most media outlets are owned by conservative people and absolutely huge corporations to manipulate you. In the UK, that comes in the forms of like the print press mainly as well, but also like News UK owned by Rupert Murdoch, who also used to own Fox News. But loads of conservative businessmen also own all your media in the US. In America, your only choices on corporate news are far right on Fox or centre-right on MSNBC and CNN. Because the American political spectrum is so warped, it's actually pretty laughable to think that anyone is getting like liberal brainwashing from their late night TV shows and, I don't know, news. So one more clip I want to play you. The absolute far-right zealot, Ben Shapiro, going off on this one as you'd probably expect him to.
How could Florida do this? They're saying don't say gay. How dare they do all of this? And it's not even relevant, say the left. And I mean, why would you even do this? We're not doing this at school. No, you are doing this at school. You are clearly doing this at school. According to the new 2022 New Jersey State Sexual Education Guidelines, they now include gender identity instruction for elementary schoolers. One lesson plan, purple, pink, and blue, according to Fox News, instructs teachers to talk to first graders about gender identity. The first objective is to have the students be able to define gender, gender identity, and gender role stereotypes. The lesson's second objective is to have student name at least 2 things they've been taught about gender role stereotypes and how those things may limit people of all gender. Gender identity is that feeling of knowing your gender. You might feel like you're a boy. You might feel like you're a girl, the lesson plan states. You might feel like you're a boy even if you have body parts that some people might tell you are girl parts. You might feel like you're a girl even if you have body parts that some people might tell you are boy parts. Some people might tell you a penis is a boy part, but it's not, according to New Jersey public schools. I mean, this is sick and perverse kind of stuff. It really is. And it is promoted by the media and it is promoted by interest groups who continue to dominate the political spectrum. For example, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation put out a tweet, March 10th, 2022, quote, corporations need to be held accountable for their silence on anti-LGBTQ bills in states where they do business. In other words, unless major entertainment media continue to mirror the precept of the radical left, they will be targeted by interest groups, and the media will help them in that targeting.
Far-right conservative commentator Ben Shapiro complaining about political interest groups. That's so ironic. Conservative interest groups, of course, don't exist. The Israeli lobby, which Ben Shapiro supports, they don't exist either. There's nothing like that in America apart from, I guess, LGBT interest groups. Again, these people are just so insufferable. And the description of how that school would teach young children about transgender people sounds like really, really harmless in the sense that it's done in a way that would help children understand and would make children more tolerant and just see this thing as normal. But of course, people like Ben Shapiro, religious zealots, don't want people to see this as a normal thing. That's why they're so against it. You know, these guys, with Ben Shapiro, he's not even trying to pretend he's not homophobic or transphobic. He just is. And it's based in his religion, it's based in his conservative politics, and he doesn't even try and hide that. While the Anti-SJWs often try and say, like, we don't hate diversity, we just hate the way it's done. But now it seems like they're not even bothering with this. But the rhetoric you see in all these videos and what they're promoting, and they're promoting DeSantis, plays into, like I said, very, very old homophobia and transphobia and accusations that these types of people are groomers. And this is something that, of course, these guys weren't primarily saying in these videos, but a phrase that has taken off on social media and in conservative media as well. Like, the left is trying to brainwash and sexualize your kids, and they're really playing into conspiracy theories. Like, they don't care anymore. They're just going to play into them and make this stuff up. It also reminds me a lot of, like, cultural Marxism, even like Judeo-Bolshevism, in that there is some sort of, like, left-wing conspiracy to manipulate your children and, like, indoctrinate them in this gender theory. And we all know who the old enemies of that used to be in the 1950s. It was the Frankfurt School and the Jewish philosophers who came to the United States and often, like Reich, specialized in things like sex. And it's not surprising there are so many far-right Nazi types involved who often tie this back to George Soros as well. Ben Shapiro, crusader against anti-Semitism, I'm sure he's very concerned about that as well. So I want to dwell on the woke corporation thing a bit just to have some fun before we get into a more serious part of the video about this media framing of groomers and the actual real-world tangible effects of violence on the LGBT community. So I came across this tweet from Jake Hammerham. This is one of the funniest things I've seen online in a while, and it's a website called Cancel This Company. I thought conservatives hated cancel culture, and the thumbnail is hilarious of all the companies that apparently woke on it. NFL, Facebook, Amazon, Airbnb, AT&T, Disney, Google, loads of, like, absolutely hilarious ones. And I went on the website, and the start of it is called The Big List of Woke Left-Wing Companies That You Should Boycott. Introduction. Once upon a time, the cardinal rule of business was to never even discuss politics, yet nowadays large corporations are brazenly choosing to alienate half the country by smearing Trump and Republicans, by attacking voting integrity laws, by pushing for censorship of conservative speech, and by fomenting the Democrat Party's toxic culture war, including by pushing the false and racist narrative, of systemic racism. Fortune 500 companies are literally keeping track of employees by race and have launched training campaigns to indoctrinate employees into critical race theory, eerily reminiscent of early Nazi Germany, because I always remember all those Germans being indoctrinated into critical race theory. Most of these woke companies are in essence hate groups that push racial polarization by supporting the violent Marxist group Black Lives Matter and other race-mongering groups such as the ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center. While some companies have posted quick tweets or buried a pandering webpage, others have made huge donations to go along with the rhetoric. As a whole, most of these companies are a danger to our country, our freedoms, and our values. This is why we must stop feeding the beast that is using profits from purchases to fuel the destruction of our country. Show them what 74 million plus consumers can do to their profit margins. It's your civic duty. So just like on the list is pretty hilarious. I've already gone through some of them. Amazon, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Apple, and Microsoft. A funny one for me was Coca-Cola, and on the page it says, while it's bad, Donald Trump has called for the boycott of the left-wing company. Coca-Cola's left-wing CEO, James Quincy, went on CNBC to declare Georgia's legislation to restore order in voting laws as unacceptable and a step backwards. Coke wants more censorship on social media. Let these communists know what you think. So Coca-Cola, the company that poisons water sources and arms fascist death squads to clear land for them and destroys communities by giving them loads of free coke in exchange for destroying their water sources, is apparently a communist company. It's good to know that, I guess. And then the Walt Disney Company boycott this sick democratic propaganda arm, and it has a flag of the Soviet Union on it. Shades of 1933 to 1934 Nazi Germany, the Walt Disney Company wants to tamp down on white people. According to a whistleblower, Disney believes that America is founded on racism and encourages white employees to complete a white privilege checklist. Disney launched a diversity and inclusion program called Reimagine Tomorrow, which includes trainings on systemic racism, white privilege, white fragility, white saviors, and anti-racism. Disney claims that America has a long history of systemic racism and transphobia. I mean, these are all true things, and tells employees that they must take ownership of educating yourself about anti-black racism. Lucasfilm fired conservative Gina Carano for comparing being a Republican to being Jewish in early Nazi Germany. Okay, that seems fair enough. We note that today's cancel culture, brown shirts, and anti-Republican media propaganda is absolutely similar to Germany 1933. People who are far-right conservatives in America who would totally be a fanatical Nazi supporter if they're around in Germany 1933, stop comparing yourself to Jewish people, racial minorities, and communists in Germany 1933. How poor is American education that they somehow think anyone not being totally ideologically in line with Donald Trump makes you a communist and makes them like a Jewish person in Nazi Germany? Again, absolutely insane. It must be verging on some form of Holocaust denial at this point to even compare the two situations, and probably like a lot of these people do probably deny that as well, because so many people involved in this are actual Nazis, or at least verging on Nazis. But again, I wanted to talk about the groomer thing and how mainstream American outlets are trying to label anyone who's against this bill as some sort of sex predator. So on The Federalist by Tristan Justice, Americans are turned off by Disney's groomer crusade, according to a new poll. Americans are turned off by the Walt Disney Corporation's crusade to indoctrinate children with explicit concepts about sex and sexuality, according to a new poll. So another article, The American Conservative, Disney Goes Groomer. An article talking about the grooming thing a bit more by Kaylee Rogers by 538. Why so many conservatives are talking about grooming all of a sudden. Grooming has become the most recent scare tactic of choice for the right. Fox News host Laura Ingraham included a segment on her show last month where she claimed public schools had become grooming centers where sexual brainwashing takes place. Marjorie Taylor Greene recently tweeted that the Democrats are the party of grooming and transitioning children. Last week, One American News host Chanel Ryan even called President Joe Biden the groomer-in-chief. This rhetoric also harkens back to age-old attacks on the LGBTQ community, casting LGBTQ people as child predators, and their very existence as something inherently sexual was a tactic used by anti-LGBT activists since the 1970s in their efforts to stifle or roll back their legal protections. So now I want to go onto the real awful consequences of this and its violence against the LGBT community. So, an article by The Independent. GOP groomer smears are sparking a new wave of anti-LGBT violence. So, harasser targets gay couples' young children. On the 12th of April, Robbie Pierce and his husband took their 2 young children on a long train ride up the California coast for a spring break trip. I read this on Twitter a couple of days ago. Their 6-year-old son was proud to have used a downstairs restroom near the seats by himself twice, but he refused to go by himself a third time. He said he was afraid. As the Amtrak train pulled into Deridian Station in San Jose while the family was playing and talking from their seats, a man approached the family and screamed at their son, "Remember what I told you, they stole you, they're pedophiles, they hurt kids." It took a minute for me to process what was even happening, Mr. Pierce says. At first I couldn't tell if he was just a loud, gruff person, so I was waiting to understand the words he was saying, and it increased in volume and anger, and he was completely shouting. Both of my children started crying, and he just continued to shout. I just said, "Move away, go away from us, get away from my family." Mr. Pierce says the man then shouted back, "That's not a family, you're groomers, they stole you." Eventually, an Amtrak employee tried to get the man to sit in his seat. Roughly 1 hour after the man started screaming, police removed him from the train. It wasn't until later that the couple's son, who is black, said the man told him that his adopted parents stole him. So he told The Independent, "What we need is people to stand up for us when we're not there. We need people to never allow that kind of rhetoric to spread and to always point out how absurd and harmful it is. We just have to expose it for how foul and toxic it is and don't let it spread. That's what's going to lead to tragedy if the rhetoric is allowed to spread." So another one, Saoirse Gowan was listening to music on her headphones as she rode the DC's Green Line at around 9:45 p.m. on the 9th of April. At first she ignored the yelling because she heard it off to her side, thinking it might be someone having a mental health episode. Then the unknown man positioned himself in her view and started filming her, talking in a way that suggested to Mrs. Gowan that he was live streaming or recording for a distant audience, preaching to his followers. Bystanders did nothing, and the situation only stopped when a police officer boarded the train. I felt completely trapped, like the guy is going to block me from getting off the train. He starts leaning extremely heavily on these child groomer tropes that have been pushed extensively in conservative political campaigns and in the right-wing media in the US, and also to a large extent in parts of the UK. The word groomer was being used throughout the 10 minutes of what was happening. It's a traumatic memory. Fearing for her safety, Mrs. Gowan, who grew up in Ireland and has lived in the US since 2018, began recording her own video which shows the man accusing her of being a sick fuck and a pervert and ranting about her Chinese communist handlers, mirroring a common trope in far-right communities of seeing the hand of the Chinese Communist Party behind US domestic politics. You hear a lot of people be like, well, if I ever met a paedophile, I'd rip his head off, or stuff like that. And when that language gets applied to people who haven't done anything wrong, who are just trying to live their lives, who are just trying to be themselves, it creates a situation in which people not only have prejudices, but are able to justify individual acts of violence and retaliation against transgender people in public. So you guys might not see like the explicit link between what the anti-SJW nerd channels are saying and rhetoric like that, but it shows an increasing trend that insane American conspiracy theories are going mainstream, to see the Chinese communist hand everywhere, to see like the push for LGBT rights being something to do with grooming and attacking children. Like, what conspiracy theory does that all remind you of? And these guys are happy to push it to help their side win at the expense of making loads of different groups of people very unsafe, specifically the LGBT community, who are already way more unsafe than most. And like this woman said, if you think a trans person or a gay person is legit trying to indoctrinate your kid, or maybe might be a pedo or something like that, you can rationalize your violence towards them and your hatred towards them, because everyone hates those types of people. Like, it's famous in prison, if you are someone who does this, it's likely you're going to get attacked, possibly way worse, because loads of people have children themselves, even bad people, so they hate these types of predators. But then if you start calling every Democrat, every liberal, every leftist, every gay person, every trans person, and either a supporter of this or one themselves, then it makes it far more easier to justify violence in your head against them. And this is the situation we are at right now. And people like Ben Shapiro are happy to push this shit, and they don't even care that a lot of these conspiracy theories even involved in this stuff are actually very anti-Semitic as well. They don't care that it emboldens the far right and makes them more mainstream. Ben Shapiro is just a grifter, and he's happy to ally with anyone who can push his own religious conservatism and his religious fanaticism, where those anti-SJWs, in my mind, are massive grifters, but also it's very, very sinister that they are holding up Ron DeSantis, someone who is normalizing this, legislating this into law, and really fostering this culture war, and they're acting like he's a great ally for people who are like sick of woke politics. But in my mind, this is where it always ends. If you have grown up like as a teenager, listening to these people talk about Star Wars, and then they start talking about this stuff, what do you think your politics are going to be? These people are dangerous because they actually indoctrinate young people in very, very sinister conspiracy theories, that the end result being you often get violent outbursts against the LGBT community. So the whole culture war against trans people is just the repackaged crusade against gay people in the 70s and 80s, but that was done primarily by the religious right. And for a lot of people, there isn't much religious about this. They just want to protect their children from supposed groomers, as they like to say. If you see this happening in public, you've got to do something. And I've seen numerous reports of like people saying, when I stood up, more people stood up. And that's what you got to do, because most people are scared to do it on their own. But a lot of people in maybe more urban places and more progressive places, they are like fundamentally decent people, maybe against harassment, but they're often too scared, especially if it is like a physically intimidating person as well, who might seem a bit unhinged. But you do have to stand up for these people. As someone who has had those moments in my life where you've like stood up for your friends in the face of like violence and stuff, it is really hard. And especially when you kind of know sometimes there can be bad consequences coming out of that. I get it, it is really hard, but if you are a good person, you've just kind of got to accept it sometimes. I know personally myself, when I've been in situations like this, not in terms of like actual discrimination, but in terms of like physical threats of violence from people, I have begrudgingly stood up for myself despite not wanting to incur like further harassment or further violence, but it's just been the right thing to do. But sometimes when I've done that, and when I was a kid this led to me getting kicked the shit out of, but when I was a bit older I've done that, and it has made people back off when you have more people standing up to people. And this is something like we all need to talk about, and something we all need to push back against. Anyway, that is it for the video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching.